Hi guys, welcome to Boston Jane Wilderness Days. We have Miss Lady will be joining us in this reading today. She's very interested in Boston Jane. Here's what the cover looks like of this book. You can see it's a kind of thrashed. I've had it for a long time and I've loaned it out to a lot of students. But that's what it looks like, Boston Jane Wilderness Days. It's by Jennifer L. Holm, just like the other one. I have never read this book either. I've never read the second or third, so I'm really excited to read this with you guys. We did already read chapter 1. It is in the YouTube, so if you didn't catch chapter 1 when I had posted it, it's in the YouTube, so you can find that. We ended chapter 1, spoiler alert if you haven't read it. We ended chapter 1 with Jane receiving a letter that Papa had passed away, and she fainted with that news. All right, actually the letter was from Papa, but she knew that he had passed away. Okay, chapter 2, or All Alone in the World. When I came to, I found myself on a hard bunk in a flea, filthy-ridden cabin. The settlement at Shoalwater Bay was barely a settlement at all. In the center of a muddy clearing up from the winding beach stood Mr. Russell's pioneer cabin, which doubled as a trading post, and inside it I now lay. A slender stream running alongside the cabin led to the Chinook village, where my friends Carruxo is Handsome Jim. Remember, he changed his name after so many... Oh, we have someone else joining us. Hello. It's like a cat book. He changed his name after like Suis and all of the Native Americans had died from the measles, because he believes that the Memalus, the spirits, will come and find him. So now I have to try to say this name. Carruxo. So Carruxo, or Handsome Jim. And Chief Toke and Sudi lived. Near a spot on the stream where the Chinooks lived to gather water was a small rustic chapel. There, Father Joseph, a French Catholic missionary, preached and lived. Farther up the bay, a pioneer named McCarty and his Chinook wife had a cabin. Mr. Russell's cabin had been my home, I'll bet a poor excuse for one, since arriving on the bay in April. I had been obliged to take up residence there because my former betrothed had abandoned me, without bothering to arrange suitable accommodations. The inside of the cabin consisted of a ramshackle grouping of wooden bunks lining 2 walls, a rickety set of shelves that contained trading supplies, and a sawbuck table where meals were generally given. The floor was hard-packed dirt, and the cabin had a tendency to attract local vermin, despite my hard work trying to keep it clean. Then again, the vermin would be like rats and, mice and those kind of, were quite probably attracted by the filthy pioneer men who thought it perfectly reasonable to take a bath once a month. Any pioneer man passing through Shoalwater Bay looking to make his fortune was welcome to stay in the cabin where I resided. Needless to say, I was now rather unfortunately used to the sound of snoring men. "Jane," a deep voice said. I looked up to see the worried, bearded face of Mr. Swan, a decidedly curious man who had come to the bay all the way from Boston to study the Chinook Indians. His spectacles were balanced precariously on his bulbous nose as he surveyed me anxiously. He had a thick white beard and flyaway hair. This eccentric, excitable older man had been like a father to me in the time that I'd resided here on Shoalwater Bay. A father. I remembered at once the reason I was lying here and squeezed my eyes shut. Papa was dead. My only sweet Papa. Hot tears slipped from my eyes and I felt gasps rising in my throat. "Oh, my dear girl," Mr. Swan said awkwardly, smoothing back my untidy red hair. "I am so terribly sorry." But something inside of me was draining out, falling away, and although I heard the concern in his voice, my mouth couldn't form any words. All I could think was that Papa was gone. It was too much to live, knowing that I was all alone in this cold, lonely world. I turned away and closed my eyes. Remember, she has no other family. Her mother had passed away. She was the only child, so she really has no family now. When I next was aware of opening my eyes, the wind hissed softly through the tiny window, promising cold days ahead. It was September, but it looked the same as when I had arrived at first in April. Nothing but gray gloom in all directions and endless rain in this soggy place in the middle of nowhere. The rain beat a steady drum on the roof, lulling me like the clip-clop sound of carriages going up and down the cobblestones of Walnut Street in Philadelphia. The men moved about the cabin, their voices hushed murmurs. I heard a crackle and hiss, smelled the scent of salt pork frying. I had been in bed for 3 days now, or was it 4? How easily time slipped away. Sometimes it felt like I had been forever in this wet, musty place. It was better, yes, better, to simply close my eyes and ignore all the voices calling me steadily, intruding on this quiet, urging me to get up, to go on, to live. Better to ignore Jehu's warm hand holding mine, his fingers smoothing down my hair, tangling in my curls like a brush. If I closed my eyes, it all came rushing back. If I had strained hard with my heart, I could hear the life I had left behind so long ago. It was so easy, really, to simply slip away, slip back to Walnut Street. One moment I was on the hard bunk in Mr. Russell's cabin, and the next I was on my childhood bed, the 4 posts rising around me like comforting sentries, the mattress soft as a cloud, everything so warm and dry and dear. A familiar voice called up to my window, "Come on, Jane." Was that my childhood playmate, Jebediah Parker, calling me to come out to play, to run up and down Walnut Street and toss apples and chase carriages and throw pats of manure? And that smell, so like the warm scents that used to drift up from Mrs. Parker's kitchen. Was she making roast pork and apples for supper? Yes, I must be in the kitchen next to the stove. The smell so strong and sweet that my mouth watered. And what was that other smell? That woodsy smell drifting on the air. I squeezed my eyes, memory straining now, recognized Papa's tobacco. "Janie," Papa said, leaning over me, his eyes full of laughter, "it's time for supper." I opened my mouth to tell him how much I missed him, how very much, and then Mr. Swan's face swam into view. A pipe balanced on his mouth, the smoke rising in his curls. He was holding a steaming bowl. "Supper, I've made my famous fisherman's pudding." He swallowed hard, worry etching lines in his face. "Please, my dear, you must eat something," he pleaded in a strained voice. But how could I eat when Papa would never take another bite again? When he would never stroll down the street or puff on his pipe or roar with laughter because he was buried in the cold, cold ground. A heavy, leaden feeling pushed down on my chest, and I closed my eyes and felt myself drift away again. Tugged like a log on the tide, the waves dragging me farther and farther until Mr. Swan's face was a speck on the horizon, and then he was gone. All the men of the settlement were worried about me, but there was nothing I could do, you see, except lie there and remember the pallor of Papa's face when I left Philadelphia. How during my final months at home he had coughed and coughed, a cough that racked his chest and left him gasping for air. I couldn't forget how unkind I had been to him, how we had fought so fiercely over my engagement to William Balt, how I, his only daughter, had abandoned him to follow a useless man west. I had chosen my own selfish desires and left my dear sweet Papa to die alone in Philadelphia. The men took turns trying to entice me back to the world of the living. Jehu recited tales of sea voyages taken before he had ever met me, how he had traveled across the seas to China, and how he had seen women in the Sandwich Islands who wore grass skirts. Mr. Swan read from his diary, describing the medicinal properties of plants and the pattern of the tides on Shoalwater Bay. Chief Toke, Sudi's father, and the kindly chief of the local Chinooks brought Sudi, who bounced on the side of the bunk, discussing her doll collection earnestly. And Father Joseph sat by my side, head bowed, whispering soft prayers in French, the words low and comforting, like a nursery rhyme. Even Brandywine, Mr. Swan's plump, flea-bitten hound, took time off from begging for food around the campsite to sleep curled up at the foot of the bunk, his cold, wet nose pressed against my feet. But it was my dear friend, Caruxo, Handsome Jim, who almost lured me back. His musical voice snaked into my dreams and tugged at me. Maybe it was the sorrow, the deep, aching emptiness that he had carried around with him that I recognized so like my own. He alone, who had recently lost loved ones in the summer outbreak, seemed to understand how difficult it was to hear the sound of life continuing, moving forward so effortlessly, as if Papa had never lived at all, as if the world could go on without his looming, booming laugh and kind eyes. Caruxo sat quietly beside me, chanting softly in Chinook. "Hello, Moosum," he whispered. and it sounded like the wind whipping through the cedar trees, the sound washing over me like fog on the bay. But then his voice drifted away and I couldn't hear him. It was as if I were too far away, and maybe I was. So for days and days and days, she's just laying there, falling in and out of consciousness, refusing to go on living because she's so upset and guilt-ridden about how she treated her dad before she left. Dang gal, you stink worse than a beaver rotting in the sun, a voice said loudly. I heard the distinct sound of spitting, followed by the soft, wet noise of tobacco hitting the floor. I blinked my eyes open to see Mr. Russell towering over me. When I had first arrived on the bay, this filthy, buckskin-clad, ill-mannered mountain man, much given to spitting tobacco in my general direction, had spent his days ordering me about the cabin as if I were a maid. But as time passed, I had grudgingly come to respect, and I suppose admire, the gruff, long-whiskered man who ate whatever I placed before him. What's going on here, gal? I go away hunting for a few days and come back and find you lying in bed like a lump when there's mending to be done, Mr. Russell barked impatiently. And all these here men have been mollycoddling you while you stink up the place. I think that's hilarious that Mr. Russell is telling her that she stinks. She must smell pretty bad. I flipped over and stared out the window, watching the rain drop in a steady patter, his voice lost in the swirl of the wind. You hear me, gal? I said you stink. Suddenly, my blanket was whipped away and the world tilted. Mr. Russell threw me over his shoulder unceremoniously and carried me, dirty blanket in hand, out of the cabin. Oh my gosh. So he whipped the blanket off and he's got her over his shoulder. He dropped me on the rickety front porch in the pouring rain with a resounding thump. And then he closed the door with a bang and locked it. I lay there in my soggy blanket, stunned. For the first time in all these long days, I felt a faint glimmer of something rush through me. A hot feeling, a hot, furious feeling. Anger. The loathsome man had locked me out of the cabin in the middle of a rainstorm. I started to pound on the door of the cabin. Let me in, I shouted, my voice hoarse from disuse. I heard him guffawing on the other side of the door. Gal, you been rotting in that bed for nearly 2 weeks and you smell worse than brandy wine. You ain't coming back in here until you're scrubbed up. Even in my dark mood, I hardly thought that he should be the one to complain of such things. Mr. Russell was notorious for his lack of bathing. You horrible man, I pounded on the door, but all I heard was laughing. I see you're finally up. I whirled around. Sorry, it's Jehu. I whirled around to see Jehu standing there. Shaking his head, amusement in his eyes, I clutched my dirty blanket to me and glared. That blasted man threw me out of the cabin, I sputtered furiously. Jehu squinted at me through the rain dripping from his wet hair. Seems he did. Just then, Mr. Swan and Caruso appeared. Capital, you're up, dear girl, Mr. Swan said in a relieved voice. We were on the verge of taking Toke's advice and tossing you into the spring. His smile slipped a little as he took in my ratty, tangled hair and my filthy woolen nightdress. But really, my dear, perhaps you ought to consider a bath. Jehu raised his eyebrows slightly. Oh, I huffed and stormed away through the mud. So that's the end of chapter 2. They're just getting us used to the characters, like if someone's reading this book for the first time. But that's really funny because she's all about being clean and she's stinking up the place. So Mr. Russell threw her out. Okay, I like that. That's funny. All right, I'll see you next time for chapter 3.